They searched for 10 days. They brought in helicopters, tracking dogs, the National Guard. They combed through every inch of forest, knocked on every door, stopped every car on Route 20. For 44 years, the family believed Marcus Sullivan had been taken, snatched by a stranger, driven across state lines, lost forever to the vast and hungry world beyond their small Massachusetts town. They were wrong. He'd never left at all. He'd been there the whole time, buried in a place so obvious that nobody thought to look. And the man who put him there? He'd watched them search. Subscribe to Greg's Cold Files, where the truth is always closer than you think. Part 1. The morning of October 14th, 1980, arrived cold and gray over Millbury, Massachusetts, the kind of autumn day where the sky pressed low and heavy and the smell of wood smoke drifted through the mobile home parks scattered along the edges of town. It was a Tuesday, which meant most of the adults in Pine Ridge mobile home community were either at work or getting ready to leave, and the handful of children who lived there had the run of the place for a few precious hours before school pickup time. Marcus Sullivan was 6 years old. He had brown hair that his mother, Diane, kept a little too long because haircuts cost money, and she was always working, always stretched thin. He wore a red windbreaker that morning, too big for him, a hand-me-down from a cousin in Worcester, and a pair of blue sneakers with the laces double-knotted because he hadn't quite mastered tying them himself. His face was round and freckled, his front tooth chipped from a fall off the rusted swing set behind trailer number 12, and his voice carried across the park when he got excited, which was often. Marcus lived with his mother and his 7-year-old sister, Jennifer, in a single wide at the far end of Willow Lane, one of the gravel roads that crisscrossed Pine Ridge. The trailer was small, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen barely wide enough for 2 people to stand side by side, a living room with a couch that folded out into a bed. Diane worked 2 jobs, mornings at the diner on Route 20, evenings cleaning offices in downtown Worcester. She left the trailer at 6 a.m. most days and didn't get home until after dark. A neighbor, Mrs. Halloran, was supposed to check on the kids, but Mrs. Halloran was 68 and hard of hearing, and mostly she just sat in her lawn chair with a cigarette and a crossword puzzle and trusted that Jennifer, responsible for her age, would keep Marcus out of trouble. Jennifer did her best. She was a serious child, small for 7, with the same brown hair as Marcus, but straighter, cut blunt at her shoulders. She wore glasses with pink plastic frames that she hated, and she carried a small notebook everywhere, writing down things she noticed: birds, license plates, the names of dogs she met. She understood, in the way children often do, that her mother was tired and that money was tight and that she needed to be good, to not make things harder. She made Marcus breakfast that morning, cereal with the last of the milk, and told him they could play outside for a little while, but only in the yard, only where she could see him. But Timothy Pratt had other ideas. Timothy was Marcus's cousin, 6 years old, stocky and loud, and perpetually scraped up from one adventure or another. His family lived 3 trailers down, and his mother, Diane's younger sister Karen, worked nights at a gas station and slept during the day. Timothy spent most of his waking hours unsupervised, and he liked it that way. He showed up at Marcus's trailer that morning around 10, banging on the aluminum door with the flat of his hand. "Come on," he said when Jennifer opened the door. "Let's go to the woods." Jennifer frowned. "We're not allowed." "Your mom's not here," Timothy said. "How's she gonna know?" The woods Timothy was talking about sat just beyond the edge of the trailer park, a dense tangle of oak and pine that stretched north for about a quarter mile before opening up into farmland. It wasn't particularly dangerous, no cliffs, no deep water, but Diane had forbidden Marcus and Jennifer from playing there. "Too easy to get lost," she said. "Too far from help if something happened. Too close to Route 20, where trucks and cars roared past at 60 miles an hour, and drivers didn't always pay attention. "I don't think—" Jennifer started, but Marcus was already pulling on his windbreaker, his face bright with excitement. "Please, Jenny," he said, "just for a little bit." Jennifer hesitated. She looked out at the gray sky, at Mrs. Halloran dozing in her chair, at Timothy's expectant grin. She thought about the notebook in her pocket, about how boring it was to stay in the yard all morning, about how Marcus had been cooped up all weekend because it had rained. She thought about how their mother would never know, as long as they were back before lunch. "Okay," she said finally, "but only for an hour, and stay where I can see you." They crossed the gravel road and ducked through a gap in the chain-link fence that marked the edge of the property. The woods were quiet that morning, the ground soft with fallen leaves that muffled their footsteps. Jennifer walked a few yards in and then stopped, sitting down on a fallen log with her notebook. She could see Marcus and Timothy from there, two small figures moving between the trees, their voices carrying back to her in bursts of laughter. Marcus had brought his favorite toy with him, a small metal truck, dull red with chipped paint and wheels that still turned. It had been his father's once, or so Diane had told him, though Marcus had no memory of his father, who'd left when Jennifer was 3, and Marcus wasn't even born yet. The truck was the only thing Marcus had that connected him to a man he'd never known, and he carried it everywhere, to bed, to the kitchen table, into the yard. He rolled it along logs and over rocks, making engine noises in his throat, narrating elaborate scenarios involving construction sites and rescue missions. Timothy wanted to go deeper into the woods. "Come on," he said, tugging Marcus's sleeve. "Let's go to the big tree." The big tree was an oak about 100 yards in, massive and half dead, its branches twisted into shapes that looked almost like faces if you squinted. Timothy had been there before with some older kids from the park, and he liked the way it made him feel brave, like an explorer. "Jennifer said to stay close," Marcus said, glancing back toward his sister. "She can't even see us from here," Timothy said. "Don't be a baby." Marcus wasn't a baby. He followed Timothy deeper into the woods, clutching his truck in one hand. The trees grew thicker here, the light dimmer. They passed a rusted shopping cart half buried in leaves, a scattering of beer cans, a torn trash bag leaking something dark and unpleasant. Timothy ran ahead, whooping, and Marcus tried to keep up, his sneakers catching on roots and rocks. And then he tripped. It wasn't a bad fall, just a stumble over a half-buried stone, but it was enough to send Marcus sprawling forward onto his hands and knees. His truck flew out of his grip and disappeared into the leaves. He sat up, his palms stinging, dirt smudged across his windbreaker, and immediately started crying. "It's gone," he wailed. "My truck's gone." Timothy stopped and turned back. "It's right there, stupid. Just look for it." But Marcus couldn't see it. The leaves were thick and brown, and the truck was small, and no matter how hard he looked, he couldn't find it. He started crying harder, his face red and blotchy, his breath coming in short gasps. "I can't leave without it," he sobbed. "I can't. It was my dad's." Timothy knelt down and kicked through the leaves, but he couldn't find the truck either. Marcus was spinning now, turning in frantic circles, his cries growing louder. "Okay, okay," Timothy said, frustrated. "Just stay here. I'll go get Jennifer. She'll help us look." Marcus nodded, hiccuping, wiping his nose on his sleeve. Timothy turned and jogged back toward the edge of the woods, leaving Marcus standing alone in the dim light, surrounded by trees and silence. Jennifer was still on the log, writing something in her notebook, when Timothy burst out of the tree line. "Marcus lost his truck," he said, breathless. "He's crying. He won't come back without it." Jennifer stood up immediately, her face tight with worry. "Where is he?" "By the big tree. Come on." They ran back into the woods together, Jennifer's heart pounding. She called Marcus's name as they moved through the trees, her voice sharp with panic. Timothy led her to the spot where he'd left Marcus, but when they got there, Marcus wasn't there. "He was right here," Timothy said, his voice suddenly small. Jennifer looked around wildly. The woods were still and quiet. No sound of crying, no red windbreaker, no small boy searching through leaves. She called his name again, louder this time, and then again, her voice cracking. Nothing. She and Timothy searched for 20 minutes, calling and calling, before Jennifer finally grabbed Timothy's arm and said, "We have to go get help." They ran back to the trailer park, both of them crying now, and found Mrs. Halloran still in her chair. "Marcus is gone," Jennifer said, her voice shaking. "We can't find him." Mrs. Halloran didn't understand at first. She was old and slow, and the kids were always running off somewhere. But Jennifer was insistent, her face pale, and finally Mrs. Halloran heaved herself up and went to wake Karen Pratt, and Karen called the police. The first officer arrived at 11:17 a.m. His name was Patrick Dunn, 26 years old, fresh from the academy, and he took one look at Jennifer's tear-streaked face and Timothy's shaking hands and radioed for backup. Within 30 minutes, 4 more patrol cars had arrived. By 1 p.m., the Millbury Fire Department had brought in 2 engine companies and their chief. By 2 p.m., the command post had been established in the gravel parking area near the fence line, a folding table covered with maps and radios and styrofoam cups of coffee going cold. By nightfall, more than 60 people were searching the woods. Detective Harold Penske arrived at Pine Ridge Mobile Home Community at 3 p.m. that first day. He was 42 years old, a broad-shouldered man with thinning hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. He'd been with the Massachusetts State Police for 18 years, most of them spent working property crimes and domestic disputes, but he'd handled a few missing persons cases over the years, and he knew how these things usually went. Kids wandered off, got disoriented, ended up a mile away crying under a tree. Or they got picked up by a non-custodial parent, a messy divorce playing out in real time. Or, worst case, they drowned in a pond or got hit by a car, and you found them within 24 hours. He didn't think Marcus Sullivan was going to be worst case. Not at first. Penske interviewed Jennifer and Timothy separately, his voice calm and steady. Jennifer told him about the woods, about how they weren't supposed to be there, about how she'd stayed on the log and Marcus had gone deeper in with Timothy. She cried the whole time, her hands twisting in her lap, and Penske had to stop twice to let her catch her breath. Timothy told him about the fall, the lost truck, Marcus's tears. "I told him to stay put," Timothy said, his voice barely a whisper. "I told him I'd be right back." Penske asked if they'd seen anyone else in the woods, a car, a person, anything unusual. Both kids said no. He asked if Marcus would have followed a stranger. Jennifer shook her head hard. "Mom always told us not to," she said. "Marcus knew. He wouldn't." But Penske had been a cop long enough to know that what kids knew and what kids did when they were scared were often 2 different things. He walked the woods himself that afternoon, accompanied by a K-9 unit from Worcester. 2 German shepherds, trained in search and rescue, noses to the ground. They picked up Marcus's scent immediately near the spot where Timothy said he'd left him, a small clearing surrounded by oaks, the ground torn up from where the boy had been kicking through leaves. The dogs pulled their handlers west, deeper into the woods, their tails stiff and alert. Penske followed, his boots crunching through the undergrowth, his eyes scanning the trees for any sign of a red windbreaker or a small body lying still. The trail led them about 50 yards before it simply stopped. The dogs circled, whining, their noses pressed to the dirt, but the scent was gone. Just ahead was the tree line, and beyond that a narrow strip of scrub grass and weeds, and then Route 20, 4 lanes of asphalt humming with traffic even at 4 in the afternoon. Penske stood at the edge of the highway and watched the cars stream past, semis hauling freight to Connecticut, sedans with Massachusetts plates, a pickup truck with a loose tailpipe rattling. He thought about how easy it would be for a small boy to wander out onto the shoulder, confused and crying, looking for help. He thought about how easy it would be for someone to stop, to offer a ride, to say they'd take him home. He thought about how Route 20 connected to Interstate 395 just 3 miles east, and how once you were on that highway, you could be in Rhode Island in 20 minutes, Connecticut in 40, New York in 3 hours. He went back to the command post and told the other officers to expand the search to Route 20. Check every rest stop, gas station, and truck stop between here and the Connecticut border, he said. Get his picture out to every police department, every state trooper, every convenience store clerk. If someone grabbed him, they would have used this highway. The search intensified. By the second day, the National Guard had arrived with helicopters equipped with thermal imaging cameras. They flew low over the woods in tight grids, the thump of rotor blades echoing across Pine Ridge. Volunteers organized themselves into search lines, 20 people across, walking shoulder to shoulder through the trees and calling Marcus's name until their voices went hoarse. Local Boy Scouts brought chainsaws and cleared paths through the denser brush. Divers from the state police checked Martin's Pond about 2 miles north, even though there was no reason to think Marcus would have made it that far. On day 3, they found a child's sneaker near the access road that led to Route 20. Blue, small, the right size. For 10 minutes, everyone held their breath while an evidence technician photographed it and bagged it. Then Diane Sullivan arrived at the command post, brought there by Officer Dunn, and looked at the sneaker and shook her head. "That's not his," she said, her voice flat. "His had red stripes. That one doesn't." It wasn't Marcus's shoe. It had probably been there for months, left behind by some other kid on some other day. But for 10 minutes, everyone had believed they'd found something real. They found other things, too. A blue jacket that turned out to belong to a teenager from the high school. A rusted bicycle frame half buried in a stream. A child's plastic toy shovel that made everyone's heart stop until they realized it was green, not red, and had been there long enough for moss to grow on it. Each false alarm was a small death, a flicker of hope snuffed out. Diane Sullivan was there for all of it. She'd been at work when Marcus disappeared, wiping down tables at the Route 20 diner, pocketing dollar tips, and refilling coffee for truck drivers who barely looked at her. She didn't find out until she got home that evening and saw the police cars lining Willow Lane, their lights spinning red and blue against the gray twilight. She ran toward the command post, still in her diner uniform, the smell of grease and coffee clinging to her clothes, and demanded to know where her son was. When they told her they didn't know, when they told her Marcus had been missing for 7 hours and they still hadn't found him, she collapsed. Officer Dunn caught her before she hit the ground, and 2 paramedics had to help her to a folding chair and give her oxygen because she was hyperventilating, her whole body shaking. She spent the next 3 days at the search site. She refused to go home, refused to eat, refused to sleep. She stood at the edge of the woods with a blanket around her shoulders and watched the searchers come and go, her face hollow and gray. People brought her coffee and she let it go cold in her hands. People told her to rest and she ignored them. She gave interview after interview to local news stations, her voice breaking, her eyes red and swollen. "He's just a baby," she said over and over. "Please, if someone has him, please just bring him home. I won't be mad. I just want him back. Please." The interviews aired on the 6 o'clock news in Boston, Worcester, Springfield. Marcus's school photo appeared on screen, his round face, his chipped front tooth, his shy smile. The tip line was flooded with calls. A woman in Sturbridge said she'd seen a boy matching Marcus's description at a rest stop on the Mass Pike. Police rushed there and found a family from Ohio, their 6-year-old son bewildered by all the attention. A man in Providence said he'd seen someone putting a child into a van near the Rhode Island border. State troopers tracked down the van and found a father picking up his daughter from a soccer game. Every lead went nowhere. Jennifer stopped talking. She sat in the trailer with her Aunt Karen, staring at the wall, her notebook open in her lap, but blank. She'd written one sentence that first night in shaky letters. "This is my fault." Karen had taken the notebook away from her and held her while she cried, but Jennifer wouldn't speak, wouldn't eat, wouldn't do anything but sit and stare. Timothy was the same. He'd stopped sleeping, stopped playing. He flinched every time someone said Marcus's name. On day 5, the FBI arrived. 2 agents from the Boston field office, a man and a woman in dark suits, carrying briefcases full of psychological profiles and case studies. They interviewed Diane, asking careful questions about Marcus's father, about whether there were any custody disputes, any reason someone might target Marcus specifically. Diane told them Marcus's father had left before Marcus was born, and she hadn't heard from him in 7 years. She didn't even know if he knew Marcus existed. The agents nodded and made notes and moved on to other possibilities. They asked about neighbors, about anyone who'd shown unusual interest in Marcus or Jennifer. Diane couldn't think of anyone. Pine Ridge was full of people minding their own business, too tired and broke to cause trouble. The agents asked about her work, about whether any customers at the diner had made her uncomfortable, whether anyone had asked about her kids. Diane said no, but then she paused, thinking. There'd been a man a few months back, someone new, who'd come in 3 or 4 times and always sat in her section. He'd been friendly, asked her name, asked if she had kids. She'd thought he was just making conversation, maybe flirting a little, but it hadn't gone anywhere and she hadn't seen him since July. The agents wrote it all down. They asked if she remembered what he looked like. She said he was white, maybe 40, with dark hair and a beard. He'd driven a truck, she thought, or maybe a van. She couldn't remember the color. The description was too vague to be useful, but the agents added it to their file and said they'd look into it. By day 7, the tone of the search had changed. The helicopters were gone. The National Guard had pulled out. The volunteers had dwindled from 60 to maybe 15, mostly local people who knew the Sullivan family or just couldn't stand the thought of giving up. Detective Penske called Diane into the command post and sat her down and told her, as gently as he could, that they were transitioning from a rescue operation to a recovery operation. "What does that mean?" Diane asked, though she already knew. "It means we're not looking for Marcus alive anymore," Penske said. "It means we're looking for evidence, for anything that might tell us what happened." Diane stared at him. "No," she said. "No, he's alive. He's out there and he's scared and you're giving up." "We're not giving up," Penske said. "We're never giving up, but we have to be realistic. It's been a week. The temperature's been dropping at night. If Marcus was in these woods, the dogs would have found him by now." "Then he's not in the woods," Diane said, her voice rising. "Then someone took him. Someone picked him up and drove away, and you need to find them." Penske nodded. "That's what we think, too, and we're going to keep working the case. But we need to be smart about it. We need to focus on Route 20, on finding witnesses, on checking surveillance footage from every gas station and rest stop along the highway. That's where our answers are going to come from. Diane stood up, her hands shaking. "I want to keep looking," she said. "I'm not giving up." "I know," Penske said, "but you need to take care of yourself, too. You need to take care of Jennifer. She needs you right now." Diane walked out of the command post without another word. She went back into the woods alone and kept searching, kept calling Marcus's name, kept hoping that somehow, impossibly, he'd answer. On day 10, the active search officially ended. The command post was dismantled. The folding tables and maps and radios were packed away. The police presence shrank to just a few officers maintaining a perimeter while the forensic teams finished processing the scene. By day 12, even they were gone. Marcus Sullivan had vanished without a trace. The case file stayed open, but it was one file among hundreds, and Detective Penske had other cases demanding his attention. He worked it when he could, following up on tips that came in sporadically over the next few months. A psychic called and said Marcus was in a basement in Connecticut. Penske drove down there himself and found nothing. A woman in Worcester said she'd seen a man with a boy matching Marcus's description at a grocery store in November. Penske tracked down security footage, and it showed a father and son buying milk. In December 1980, Diane Sullivan stood at the edge of the woods where her son had disappeared and watched the first snowfall. The trees were bare, the ground frozen, and there was no sign that anything had ever happened here. No police tape, no search teams, no hope. Just silence and cold and the weight of not knowing. She didn't go home for Christmas that year. She couldn't. Marcus's stocking was still hanging in the trailer, his presents still wrapped under the tree. A puzzle, a coloring book, a toy fire truck that Diane had bought on layaway back in September. She left them there and went to her sister's house in Worcester, but she couldn't stay. Everywhere she looked, there were children, and none of them were Marcus. Jennifer spent that first Christmas staring out the window, her notebook in her lap, waiting for her brother to come home. She was 8 years old, and she already understood that the world was not a safe place, that terrible things could happen in an instant, that the people you loved could disappear and never come back. Timothy's family moved away in February 1981. Karen couldn't take it anymore. The whispers, the looks, the crushing weight of guilt every time she saw Diane. They packed up their trailer in the middle of the night and drove to New Hampshire, and Timothy never said goodbye. He carried the weight of that day with him like a stone in his chest, and it never got lighter. The first year was the hardest. Diane kept working her 2 jobs because she didn't know what else to do, but she moved through life like a ghost. She stopped returning phone calls. She stopped seeing friends. She kept Marcus's room exactly as he'd left it. His bed made, his clothes folded, his toy box in the corner with the lid open, and a few trucks and action figures scattered inside. The space on the shelf where his red truck should have been was empty, and she couldn't look at it without feeling like she was going to break in half. Jennifer retreated into herself. She stopped writing in her notebook. She stopped talking about Marcus, stopped talking much at all. She got good grades because that was what she knew how to do, but she didn't make friends, didn't join clubs, didn't do anything that might require her to explain why she was so quiet, why she flinched when people asked about her family. When she was old enough, she got a job at the library and spent her afternoons there, surrounded by books and silence. The years passed in a gray blur. Penske retired in 1982, and the case was handed off to a younger detective named Lorraine Vega, who inherited 3 file boxes full of dead ends and a family that had mostly stopped hoping. Vega was thorough and determined, but there was nothing new to find. She re-interviewed everyone, retraced every step of the original investigation, checked every tip that came in. She found nothing. In 1985, a body was found in the woods near Webster, about 15 miles from Millbury. The remains were small, a child, and for 3 agonizing weeks, Diane waited while forensic teams worked to identify them. They turned out to belong to a boy from Connecticut who'd gone missing in 1983. Not Marcus. Never Marcus. In 1991, another tip came in. A man in prison for unrelated charges said he knew what happened to Marcus Sullivan, said he'd been there, said he'd seen it. Vega drove out to the prison and interviewed him for 3 hours. His story fell apart under questioning. He'd gotten the details wrong, the date, the location, the description of Marcus. He'd just been looking for a deal, hoping to trade information for a reduced sentence. In 1997, Jennifer turned 18 and left Millbury. She went to college in Vermont, as far from Massachusetts as she could afford, and changed her major 3 times before settling on library science. She didn't go home for holidays. She called her mother once a week, short conversations where neither of them said what they were really thinking. When people asked about her family, Jennifer said she had a mother, and that was it. She didn't mention Marcus. It hurt too much to explain, and people never knew what to say anyway. Diane stayed in the trailer on Willow Lane. She couldn't leave, couldn't let go. She kept thinking that if she moved away, Marcus wouldn't be able to find his way home. People in Millbury thought she was crazy, and maybe she was, but it was the only way she knew how to keep loving a child who wasn't there. In 2000, 20 years after Marcus disappeared, the case flickered back to life briefly. A state police forensic team excavated a wooded area off Blackstone Road, about 5 miles from Pine Ridge, acting on a tip from an informant in a separate drug investigation. The informant claimed that a man involved in trafficking had buried something there in the early 80s, something connected to a missing kid from Millbury. Diane drove out to the site and watched them dig. It was summer, hot and humid, and the smell of disturbed earth hung heavy in the air. She stood behind the police tape for 3 days while the team worked, bringing in backhoes and cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar. They found trash, animal bones, the rusted frame of a motorcycle. They found nothing connected to Marcus. On the 3rd day, Detective Vega walked over to Diane and shook her head. "I'm sorry," she said. "There's nothing here." Diane nodded. She'd known, somehow, that there wouldn't be. She'd stopped hoping a long time ago. She just went through the motions now, following up on every lead because it was better than sitting still. Then, in December 2001, a name surfaced that sent a shockwave through the investigation. Leonard Garrison. Montana police had arrested Garrison in connection with the disappearance of a 12-year-old boy in Great Falls. During a search of his property, they found a toolbox containing a handwritten list titled Route 20, Fall 80, with 6 names, all children, all boys. One of them was Marcus Sullivan. Detective Vega got the call from Montana in early January 2002. Leonard Garrison, 53 years old, changed his name in 1979 after serving time for attempted abduction. In October 1980, he'd been driving a delivery route along Route 20 twice a week. He'd been arrested in 1975 for loitering near a playground in Worcester. Vega called Diane immediately. "We might have something," she said. Vega flew to Montana and interviewed Garrison. He was cold, gave them nothing. When shown Marcus's photo, he smiled. "Never seen him," he said. His lawyer shut it down after 2 hours. For 6 months, Vega tried to build a case. She confirmed Garrison drove Route 20 that fall, found witnesses who remembered his dark green Chevy with the white camper shell. But she couldn't place him in Millbury on October 14, 1980. No physical evidence. The truck had been crushed years ago. Nothing. Montana dropped the murder charges in October 2002. Garrison was convicted of kidnapping and sentenced to 70 years. He died in prison in April 2008 at age 59. He never confessed to anything. When Vega called to tell Diane that Garrison was dead, Diane asked, "Does this mean we'll never know?" "Maybe," Vega said, "or maybe it wasn't him." His death felt like losing Marcus all over again. No trial, no answers, no closure. Then, in late 2002, before Garrison's death, something else happened. A woman named Cheryl Clemens walked into the Douglas, Massachusetts police station and said her ex-husband had confessed to something terrible before he died. Robert Clemens had been a mechanic in Millbury in the early 80s. He'd worked at a garage on Route 20, just a few miles from Pine Ridge. He'd been a heavy drinker, a mean drunk, and Cheryl had left him in 1983, taking their 2 kids and moving to Rhode Island. She hadn't spoken to him in nearly 20 years, but in April 2002, 3 months before he died of a heart attack, Robert had called her. He'd been drunk, crying, barely coherent. He'd told her he'd done something terrible a long time ago. He'd told her there was a boy in the woods. He'd told her to go to a field behind the old mill on Granite Street in Douglas, and she'd find him there. Cheryl had hung up on him. She'd thought he was out of his mind, rambling nonsense. But after he died, after she'd buried him and cleaned out his apartment and found nothing but empty bottles and unpaid bills, she couldn't stop thinking about that phone call. She thought about the missing kids she'd seen on the news over the years, the families left behind, the mothers who looked like they'd aged 100 years. She thought about her own kids, grown now, safe, and how she'd feel if someone knew something and stayed silent. So she went to the police. She told them everything. She gave them Robert's name, his work history, everything she could remember from that phone call. The police contacted Detective Vega, and in January 2006, a full forensic team descended on the field behind the mill in Douglas. Diane stood behind the police tape again, watching them dig. It was winter this time, cold and gray, and the ground was frozen. The team brought in jackhammers and heaters and ground-penetrating radar. They worked for 2 days in freezing rain, and they found nothing. No remains, no clothing, no sign that a body had ever been there. Robert Clemens had been lying, or confused, or so drunk he didn't know what he was saying. Maybe he'd been talking about a different boy, a different crime. Maybe he'd made the whole thing up in some twisted attempt to hurt his ex-wife one last time. Nobody knew. Detective Vega closed the file again. She was a lieutenant by then, semi-retired, and she'd worked Marcus Sullivan's case on and off for 24 years. She'd followed every lead, interviewed every witness, pursued every theory, and she had nothing. She called Diane one more time to tell her the dig in Douglas had been a dead end. Diane didn't cry. She didn't say much at all. She just thanked Vega for trying and hung up the phone. By 2015, Diane was 63 years old and showing signs of early dementia. She'd worked at the diner until she was 60, and then her hands had started shaking too badly to carry plates. She'd quit the cleaning job a year later when she'd gotten confused about which building she was supposed to be in. She lived on Social Security and food stamps, and the trailer on Willow Lane was falling apart around her. The roof leaked. The heat barely worked. But she wouldn't move. She couldn't move. Jennifer came back to visit once in 2016 because her daughter was starting college in Boston and wanted to meet her grandmother. Diane barely recognized her. She kept calling Jennifer by her sister's name, kept asking where Marcus was, kept saying he'd be home soon. Jennifer stayed for 2 hours and then left, crying so hard she had to pull over on the side of Route 20 until she could see well enough to drive. By 2020, Marcus Sullivan was just another name in a database of unsolved disappearances. One more missing child from one more small town, lost to time and bad luck and the indifference of a world that moved on. The case file sat in a storage room in the state police headquarters, 3 boxes of paper turning yellow at the edges, gathering dust. Jennifer Sullivan, now Jennifer Marcos, was 51 years old. She lived in Portland, Oregon, as far from Millbury as she could get without leaving the country. She worked at a university library, had a grown daughter studying in London, a husband who was kind and patient and didn't ask too many questions about her childhood. She rarely thought about the woods behind Pine Ridge, or she told herself she didn't. But sometimes, late at night, she'd wake from a dream where she was 7 years old again, sitting on a fallen log with a notebook in her lap, and she'd hear Marcus crying somewhere just out of sight, his voice thin and scared, calling her name. And she'd wake up with her heart pounding and tears on her face, and the terrible certainty that if she'd just held on tighter, if she'd just made him stay in the yard, if she'd just been a better sister, he'd still be alive. She hadn't spoken to Timothy Pratt in 43 years. She didn't even know if he was still alive. She'd heard through her mother, back when Diane was still coherent enough to relay information, that Timothy had moved to New Hampshire, that he'd struggled with heroin in his 20s, that he'd been in and out of jail, that he'd gotten clean eventually and worked construction. She didn't blame him, not really. They'd both been 6 years old. They'd both been children making a child's mistake. But she couldn't talk to him, couldn't look at him, couldn't bear the reminder of the worst day of her life. And then, in September 2024, 44 years after Marcus disappeared, she got a letter. It arrived in a thin envelope with a New Hampshire postmark, addressed in shaky handwriting that looked like it had been written by someone very old or very sick. Inside was a single sheet of lined notebook paper, the kind kids use in elementary school. The handwriting was barely legible, the letters cramped and uneven, some of them trailing off as if the writer's hand had gotten tired. Dear Jennifer, it's Timothy. I don't know if you'll even read this. Cancer. Stage 4. Maybe 6 months left. I got to tell you something I never told nobody. Should have told the cops 44 years ago, but I was just a kid and I was scared. That day, when I ran back to get you, I saw a truck parked by Route 20, right past the trees. Dark green, old, had a white shell thing on the back. And there was a man there, standing by the truck, smoking, just watching the woods. He looked right at me when I ran past. Didn't say nothing, just looked. I didn't tell because I thought it didn't matter. Thought Marcus just got lost. Then days went by, then weeks. Then I was too scared to say anything because I thought I'd be in trouble. Then years, and I kept telling myself maybe I remembered it wrong. Maybe it wasn't important. But I can't forget his face, Jenny. I see it sometimes, that man just standing there. And Marcus is gone, and maybe if I'd said something that day, things would be different. I'm sorry. God, I'm so sorry. The truck was dark green, 70s maybe. White camper shell, dirty. The guy was white, 30s or 40s, dark hair, beard, jeans and a brown jacket. That's all I got. I know you probably hate me. Tell the cops if you want. Do what you got to do. I just couldn't die with this inside me. Sorry, Jenny. Tim. Jennifer read the letter 3 times, her hands shaking so badly the paper rattled. She sat on her couch in Portland, the afternoon light slanting through the windows, and felt something crack open inside her chest that she'd sealed shut 44 years ago. A dark green truck, a man with a beard, standing there, watching. She picked up her phone and called the Massachusetts State Police. Her voice was steady when she asked to speak to someone about an old case, a missing child from 1980, new information after 44 years. The operator put her on hold for 3 minutes and then transferred her to the Detective Bureau. "This is Detective Sarah Chen," a voice said. "How can I help you?" Jennifer took a deep breath. "My name is Jennifer Marcos. My maiden name was Sullivan. My brother, Marcus Sullivan, disappeared from Millbury in October 1980, and I think I might finally know what happened to him. Part 2. Detective Sarah Chen was 34 years old, and she'd been with the Massachusetts State Police for 9 years. She'd grown up in Quincy, the daughter of immigrants who'd worked 3 jobs between them to put her through college, and she'd joined the force because she believed in order, in justice, in the idea that you could make broken things whole again if you worked hard enough. She'd worked missing persons for 4 years, and she knew the statistics. She knew that after 44 years, the chances of solving a cold case were almost zero. She knew that most of the time, these calls led nowhere. A grieving family member grasping at straws, a coincidence mistaken for evidence, a memory distorted by decades of grief. But she also knew that sometimes, just sometimes, the impossible happened. She listened while Jennifer told her about Timothy's letter, about the dark green truck with the white camper shell, about the man with the beard standing there smoking, watching the woods. She took notes, her pen moving quickly across the page. When Jennifer finished, Chen was quiet for a moment. "Mrs. Marcos," she said finally, "I'm going to be honest with you. 44 years is a long time. Memories fade, witnesses die, evidence gets lost. I don't want to give you false hope, but I'm going to look into this. I'm going to pull the file and see what we have. Is Timothy willing to make an official statement?" Jennifer's voice cracked. "He's dying. Stage 4 cancer. I don't know how much time he has left." "I'll need to talk to him as soon as possible," Chen said. "Can you get me his contact information?" Jennifer gave her Timothy's phone number and address in Manchester, New Hampshire. Chen thanked her and said she'd be in touch, and then she hung up and sat staring at her computer screen for a long moment. Then she typed Marcus Sullivan, Millbury, 1980, into the state police database. 3 file boxes, dozens of leads that went nowhere. 2 major suspects, Leonard Garrison and Robert Clemens, both dead. No physical evidence, no witnesses, no body. Chen spent the rest of that day reading every page in the file. She read Detective Penske's initial reports, Detective Vega's follow-ups, the FBI analysis from 1985. She looked at the photos of Marcus, his school picture, the candid shots Diane had provided showing him playing in the yard, riding a bike that was too big for him, holding up a crayon drawing of a house and a tree. She read Jennifer's statement from October 14, 1980, read Timothy's statement, read the interviews with neighbors and volunteers and passers-by who'd seen nothing, heard nothing, remembered nothing. And then she found something interesting. On page 47 of Penske's reports, there was a note about a canvass of businesses along Route 20. One of the locations was Kowalski's Auto Repair, about 2 miles from Pine Ridge. The owner, William Kowalski, had been interviewed on October 16, 1980. He'd said he hadn't seen anything unusual that day, hadn't noticed any children near his shop, hadn't seen any vehicles that didn't belong. The interview had lasted less than 10 minutes. Penske had marked it, "No further action required," and moved on. Chen typed William Kowalski into the database. What came back made her sit up straighter. William Kowalski, born 1944, died 1995. Owned and operated an auto repair shop on Route 20 from 1978 to 1992. Lived in an apartment above the shop. Arrested in 1968 in Pennsylvania for indecent exposure near a playground. Charges dropped due to lack of evidence. Arrested again in 1973 in New York for loitering near a school. Pled guilty to a misdemeanor, served 6 months probation. Moved to Massachusetts in 1977. No further arrests on record. Chen stared at the screen. Why hadn't Penske flagged this? Why hadn't anyone looked deeper into William Kowalski? She kept reading. In 1992, Kowalski had sold the auto shop and moved to Florida. He'd died there in 1995 of a heart attack, age 51. Never married, no children, no close relatives. His property in Florida had been sold to pay off debts, and most of his belongings had been thrown away or donated. But in 1980, he'd been living and working 2 miles from where Marcus Sullivan disappeared. And he had a history. Chen picked up her phone and called the records department. "I need property records for Route 20 in Millbury," she said. "Specifically an auto repair shop owned by William Kowalski, operating from 1978 to 1992. I need blueprints, deeds, anything you have." 2 days later, she drove out to Manchester, New Hampshire, to interview Timothy Pratt. He lived in a small apartment above a laundromat, 3rd floor, no elevator. Chen climbed the stairs slowly, smelling cigarette smoke and fried food and the musty scent of old carpet. She knocked on apartment 3B and waited. Timothy opened the door. He was 50 years old but looked 70. Thin, gray, his face gaunt and his eyes sunken. He wore sweatpants and a Red Sox t-shirt that hung loose on his frame. He was connected to an oxygen tank by a clear plastic tube that looped under his nose. "You the cop?" he asked, his voice rasping. "Detective Chen, Massachusetts State Police. Thank you for agreeing to talk to me." Timothy stepped aside and let her in. The apartment was small and neat, a couch, a TV, a table with 2 chairs. No pictures on the walls, no personal touches. It felt like a place someone was just passing through. They sat at the table. Chen pulled out her notebook and a digital recorder. "Do you mind if I record this?" Timothy shook his head. "Go ahead. I ain't got nothing to hide. Not anymore." Chen hit record. "Can you tell me what you remember from October 14th, 1980? Timothy took a breath that rattled in his chest. And then he told her everything. The woods, the lost truck, Marcus crying, leaving him there, running back for Jennifer, and then the part he'd never told anyone, the truck on the access road, the man standing next to it, dark green, white camper shell, 70s model. The man was white, maybe 30s or 40s, beard, jeans, brown jacket. He'd looked right at Timothy but hadn't said anything, just watched him run past. "Did you see where the truck was parked exactly?" Chen asked. "Right by Route 20, Timothy said. There was a little dirt access road that led to the edge of the woods, near where the tree line broke. The truck was pulled off onto that road, facing toward the highway. Did you see any markings on the truck? License plate, business name, anything?" Timothy closed his eyes, thinking. "There was something on the door," he said slowly. "Words, maybe. But I was running and I didn't look close. I just saw the man and I kept going." "What time was this?" "Around 10:30, maybe. Morning." Chen made notes. "Timothy, when Detective Pensky interviewed you in 1980, why didn't you mention the truck?" Timothy's eyes filled with tears. "I was 6, he said. "I was scared. I thought Marcus just wandered off and they'd find him right away. And then they didn't, and I thought if I said something about the truck I'd get in trouble for being in the woods when we weren't supposed to be. And then days went by and it felt too late to say anything, and I convinced myself it didn't matter, that the truck was just some guy taking a break, that it had nothing to do with Marcus. I was a kid. I was stupid. I'm sorry." Chen reached across the table and put her hand on his. "You were 6 years old," she said gently. "You did nothing wrong. And you're telling me now. That matters." Timothy wiped his eyes. "Is it too late? Is he gone?" "I don't know," Chen said honestly, "but I'm going to find out." She left Timothy's apartment with a sick feeling in her stomach. A dark green truck with a white camper shell and words on the door. An access road near Route 20. A man watching the woods. She drove back to Massachusetts and went straight to the auto repair shop that had once been owned by William Kowalski. It was a different business now, a tire shop called Rapid Tire and Lube, but the building was the same. Chen walked around the property, looking at the layout. The shop faced Route 20. Behind it was a small parking lot, and beyond that, about 200 yards away, was the tree line of the woods where Marcus had disappeared. She walked to the edge of the property and found it, an overgrown dirt access road, barely visible through the weeds, that led from the back of the shop toward the woods. In 1980, before the tire shop had paved the back lot, that road would have been the main way to access the rear of the property. Chen stood there for a long time, looking at the woods, at the shop, at Route 20 humming with traffic. William Kowalski, auto repair shop owner, history of inappropriate behavior with children, living and working 200 yards from where Marcus Sullivan disappeared, driving a truck. Mechanics always drove trucks. Dark green, maybe, with a white camper shell, maybe with the shop name painted on the door. She pulled out her phone and called the records department again. "I need photos of William Kowalski's business from 1980, she said. "Any records, advertisements, phone book listings, anything that shows what his truck looked like." 3 days later, they found it. A small advertisement in the Millbury Gazette from September 1980. "Kowalski's Auto Repair, fair prices, fast service." And in the corner of the ad, a tiny photo of the shop. And parked in front of the shop, visible in the grainy black-and-white image, was a truck, dark, with a camper shell, and painted on the door, just barely visible. "Kowalski's Auto." Chen felt her heart start to pound. She called Jennifer Marcos. "I need you to come back to Massachusetts," she said. "I think we found something." By mid-October 2024, Chen had assembled a team. 2 forensic investigators, a ground-penetrating radar specialist, and a cadaver dog unit. She'd gotten a warrant to search the property that had once been Kowalski's Auto Repair. The current owner, a man named Dave Russo, who ran Rapid Tire and Lube, was confused but cooperative. "You think there's a body here?" he asked, his face pale. "We don't know," Chen said, "but we need to check." They started with the woods, the area where Marcus had last been seen. The cadaver dogs went through slowly, systematically, covering every foot of ground. They found nothing. The ground-penetrating radar showed nothing but tree roots and rocks. Then Chen made a decision that changed everything. "Check the property itself," she said. "The shop, the parking lot, all of it." The GPR team spent 2 days scanning the parking lot behind the tire shop. On the second day, late in the afternoon, they found an anomaly. About 100 yards from the back of the building, near the old access road, the radar showed a disturbance in the soil. Something buried, roughly 4 feet down. The shape was wrong for a septic tank or utility line. The shape looked like a small body. Chen called in the Massachusetts State Police Forensic Excavation Team. They arrived the next morning with shovels and screens and cameras and a medical examiner standing by. They cordoned off the area and started to dig. Diane Sullivan had died 3 months earlier, in July 2024. The dementia had taken her slowly, erasing her piece by piece until there was nothing left but a fragile shell that didn't remember Marcus, didn't remember Jennifer, didn't remember anything at all. She died in a nursing home in Worcester, and Jennifer had buried her next to an empty plot she'd reserved years ago, just in case they ever found Marcus. Now Jennifer stood behind the police tape, watching them dig up a parking lot 200 yards from the trailer where her brother had lived. She'd flown in from Portland 2 days ago. Her husband had come with her, and he stood next to her now, his arm around her shoulders. She was 51 years old, and she'd spent 44 years not knowing. The excavation took 6 hours. They had to go slowly, carefully, documenting everything. At 3 feet down, one of the investigators stopped. "I've got something," he said quietly. Chen walked over. The investigator was crouched in the hole, brushing dirt away from something white. "Bone." "Notify the M.E.," Chen said. Her voice was steady, but her hands were shaking. They found him 4 feet down, wrapped in a tarp that had mostly disintegrated. The remains were small, the bones of a child. The medical examiner would need to do a full analysis, but Chen could see a red windbreaker, mostly rotted away, and blue sneakers, still tied with double knots. She walked over to Jennifer, who was standing very still, her face white. "We found him," Chen said quietly. "I'm so sorry, but we found him." Jennifer made a sound that wasn't quite a sob and wasn't quite a gasp, and then her husband was holding her and she was crying like she hadn't cried in 44 years, crying for her brother and her mother and herself and all the time that had been stolen from them. The remains were confirmed as Marcus Sullivan 3 days later. DNA from Jennifer matched. Dental records matched. The red windbreaker matched the description from October 14, 1980. The autopsy showed blunt force trauma to the skull, consistent with being struck by a heavy object. The medical examiner estimated Marcus had died within hours of his disappearance. He'd been buried quickly, probably that same day, in a shallow grave on property owned by William Kowalski. But William Kowalski had been dead for 29 years. There would be no arrest, no trial, no chance for justice in any real sense. Chen did everything she could to build the case posthumously. She pulled every record she could find on Kowalski. She found that in 1980 he'd been the sole employee of his auto shop. He'd lived alone in the apartment above it. He'd had no alibi for October 14, 1980. He'd told Detective Pensky he'd been working alone in the shop all day, and Pensky had taken him at his word. She found that Kowalski had sold the shop abruptly in 1992, just 12 years after Marcus's death. He'd moved to Florida and lived there quietly until his death in 1995. No more arrests, no more trouble, no more children disappearing. She found a statement from a man who'd worked briefly as Kowalski's assistant in 1990. The man said Kowalski had been weird around kids, that he'd sometimes watch them playing in the woods behind the shop, that he'd made comments that made people uncomfortable. The man had quit after 2 months, but none of it mattered because Kowalski was dead and had been for decades. There was no one to arrest, no one to prosecute, no one to punish. Chen called a press conference on November 3, 2024. She stood in front of a podium at the Massachusetts State Police headquarters with Jennifer Marcos seated behind her and told the story. Marcus Sullivan, age 6, who'd disappeared from Millbury on October 14, 1980, had been found. His remains had been buried on property owned by William Kowalski, who died in 1995. Based on the evidence, Kowalski's proximity to the crime scene, his criminal history, the location of the burial, and the witness statement from Timothy Pratt regarding the dark green truck matching Kowalski's vehicle, investigators had concluded that Kowalski was responsible for Marcus's abduction and murder. "This man was interviewed in 1980 and cleared," Chen said, her voice tight with frustration. "He had a criminal history involving children. He lived and worked 200 yards from where Marcus was last seen, and he was never considered a serious suspect. That's on us. That's on the system that failed this little boy and his family. We can't bring Marcus home. We can't give his mother the answers she deserved. But we can tell the truth. And the truth is that Marcus Sullivan never left Millbury. He was taken by a predator who'd been hiding in plain sight, and he died just yards from his home. And we're sorry. We're so very sorry it took us 44 years to find him." The story made national news. The Boston Globe ran a front-page article. CNN did a segment. Reddit threads exploded with anger over how Kowalski had been overlooked, how Penske had interviewed him and moved on, how a man with a history of offenses against children had been allowed to operate a business so close to a residential area. Jennifer gave one interview to a local reporter from Millbury. She talked about Marcus, about what he'd been like. Funny, loud, always losing things, always getting into trouble. She talked about her mother, about how Diane had never stopped looking, never stopped hoping, and how it broke Jennifer's heart that Diane had died 3 months before they'd found answers. "She spent 44 years in that trailer waiting for him to come home," Jennifer said, tears running down her face. "And he was right there the whole time, 200 yards away, if they'd just looked harder, if they'd just paid attention to Kowalski, if they'd just—" She couldn't finish. The reporter waited, and then gently ended the interview. Timothy Pratt died on November 18, 2024, in a hospice in Manchester. Jennifer went to see him 2 days before he died. She sat by his bed and held his hand, and he looked at her with eyes that were already distant, already seeing something beyond this world. "Did they find him?" he whispered. "Yes," Jennifer said. "They found him. And it's not your fault, Tim. It was never your fault." Timothy closed his eyes. "I should have told," he said. "I should have said something." "You were 6 years old," Jennifer said. "You were a baby, and you told me now. That's what mattered. You told me, and we found him. You gave us that." Timothy died holding her hand, and Jennifer sat with him until the nurse came and told her it was time to go. In December 2024, Jennifer buried her brother next to their mother in a cemetery in Worcester. The funeral was small, just Jennifer and her family, a handful of people from Millbury who still remembered, Detective Chen and 2 of her colleagues from the state police. There was no body to bury, just a small urn containing ashes, but Jennifer had bought a headstone that matched their mother's. Marcus James Sullivan, 1974-1980, beloved son and brother, finally home. Jennifer stood at the grave for a long time after everyone else had left. It was snowing lightly, the same kind of cold gray day as the morning Marcus had disappeared. She thought about her mother, about how Diane had never stopped waiting, had never stopped loving a child who was already gone. She thought about Timothy, who'd carried his guilt for 44 years and had died finally free of it. She thought about Detective Penske, who'd missed it, who'd looked right at William Kowalski and let him walk away. She thought about all the ways the system had failed her brother, had failed her family, had failed everyone. And then she thought about Marcus himself. 6 years old, freckled and gap-toothed, losing his favorite toy and crying in the woods, not knowing that a monster was watching, waiting, that he'd never see his sister or his mother again, that he'd spend 44 years in a shallow grave while everyone he loved spent 44 years searching. She put her hand on the cold headstone and closed her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm sorry I couldn't keep you safe. I'm sorry it took so long. But you're home now. We found you. You're finally home." The snow fell softly around her, covering the graves in white, and Jennifer stood there until she couldn't feel her feet anymore, saying goodbye to her brother for the second time, and this time, finally, for the last. In March 2025, the Massachusetts State Police implemented new protocols for cold cases involving children. Suspects with any history of offenses involving minors would now be flagged automatically, their properties and vehicles searched thoroughly, their alibis verified independently. It was called the Marcus Sullivan Protocol, and it wouldn't bring him back, but maybe, just maybe, it would keep another child from being buried in a parking lot while everyone looked in the wrong direction. Jennifer went back to Portland. She went back to work, back to her life, back to the routines that had kept her functioning for 44 years. But something had changed. The weight she'd carried since she was 7 years old was different now. Still heavy, still there, but no longer crushing. She knew what happened. She knew where her brother was. She knew it wasn't her fault. She started writing again, for the first time since she was a child. Not in a notebook with pink plastic covers, but on her laptop late at night when she couldn't sleep. She wrote about Marcus, about Diane, about Timothy and Detective Chen, and the dark green truck, and all the missed chances and broken systems, and the terrible randomness of grief. She didn't know what she'd do with it. Maybe nothing. Maybe just keep it for herself, a way to make sense of something that could never make sense. But she wrote, and in the writing, she found something she hadn't had in decades. Not closure. That word was too simple, too neat, too false. But something else. Something quieter and more complicated. An ending, maybe. Or at least, a place to rest. On what would have been Marcus's 50th birthday, in October 2024, Jennifer went to the woods behind where Pine Ridge Mobile Home Community had once stood. The trailers were gone now, replaced by a strip mall and a Planet Fitness. But the woods were still there, unchanged, the same oak and pine that had been there in 1980. She walked into the trees until she found the spot where she thought she'd sat all those years ago, waiting for her brother to come back. She sat down on a fallen log, maybe the same one, maybe not, and opened the notebook she'd bought just for this. It was small, spiral-bound, with a blue cover. Not pink. She was 51 years old, not 7, but still. She opened it to the first page and took out a pen. She wrote, Marcus James Sullivan, age 6, disappeared from these woods on October 14, 1980. He was found on October 21, 2024. He is buried next to our mother in Worcester. This is his story. And then, because it was all she could think to do, because it was the only thing that felt right, she wrote down everything she could remember about her brother. His laugh, his chipped tooth, the way he always lost his toys, the sound of his voice calling her name, the way he'd looked that morning in his too big red windbreaker, excited to go into the forbidden woods, not knowing that he'd never come back. She filled 3 pages before the tears made it too hard to see, and then she closed the notebook and held it against her chest and let herself cry. Not the violent, gasping sobs from when they'd found his body, but something quieter. Grief, yes, but also love and memory, and the fierce determination that Marcus Sullivan, who'd lived 6 years and been forgotten by the world for 44 more, would be remembered. Not just as a tragedy, not just as a cold case solved, but as a person, a boy, a brother, someone who mattered. Jennifer stood up, brushed the dirt off her jeans, and walked out of the woods. The sun was setting, painting the sky orange and pink. She got in her rental car and drove to the cemetery, and she sat by Marcus's grave until it got dark, and then she went back to her hotel and slept without nightmares for the first time in 44 years. The next morning, she flew home to Portland. She would come back to Massachusetts once a year on Marcus's birthday to sit in the woods and write in the notebook and visit his grave. It would become a ritual, a way to hold on to him, to keep him present in a world that had moved on without him. But for now, she went home. She hugged her daughter, kissed her husband, went back to work at the university library. She answered emails and cataloged books and helped students find resources for their research papers. Normal things, small things, the things that make up a life. And in the evenings, she wrote. She wrote about Marcus and about all the other missing children whose families were still waiting, still hoping, still searching. She wrote about the failures of the system and the importance of never giving up. She wrote about 6-year-old boys in red windbreakers and the monsters who hide in plain sight. And she wrote about hope. Not the naive kind that believes everything will turn out okay, but the stubborn kind that keeps going even when it won't. The kind that says, "I will remember you. I will tell your story. You will not be forgotten." That was enough. It had to be enough, because it was all she had left to give.